Hello and welcome to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past and talk about their impact and relevance today. I'm Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end, and I'm joined, as always, by a man who never knew that the best way to fix a city full of civil disorder was to hire a couple of court jesters.
I would know that, but Brett Duville. What better way than the bards, is what I say.
Yeah, that's fair enough. You're Mr. Bard.
It's always about the bards.
Are
there really court jesters, or are you just making this up?
No? Oh, you haven't? So I've just assumed. Okay. I did make a big assumption in my intro. It's something that I think is hilarious to me. I guess I assumed that you had come upon it. So we're talking about Civilization 3 for those who are just joining us. I don't know why you would be just joining us. We're in our second episode of the series. What I discovered as a quick fix to civil disorder, civil unrest, whatever it's called, when your cities are basically in that state, which maybe you haven't had very much of. I have it all the time. You can convert population members of the population into entertainers, and that will make them happier, and then it'll basically fix it.
Oh, and I just lower taxes.
Well, I don't do that.
I mean, I don't lower them for very long, but I lower them, for a couple turns, and then everything's fine. I mean, even the revolutions when I go to a different mode of government are very quick. Like it's like one turn.
Yeah, those are quick for me as well.
Okay,
yeah.
So those are meant to be quick, I guess, because that's what everybody wants, and it's just like, oh, we're going to turn over this turn. So I guess that's reasonable. Yeah, I mean, we are playing on the easiest level of difficulty as well. I bet you really have to be careful when you time those things as well, in a more difficult game.
My civil disorder will just erupt, throughout the game, and usually it's due to overpopulation, which I was going to ask you. I don't know if you've had any discoveries with overpopulation, but I've done some reading on it, and I really can't figure out how to combat it. When you click on your numbers of your population, and it'll say why they're unhappy. The ones that are sad, at least, they'll say why they're unhappy, and almost always minor overpopulation is why they're unhappy. So, but I can't figure out what the best way is to attack that, other than converting that unhappy villager into a jester.
That's hilarious. No, see, I have not. I have had one town that's been. So I've had a couple towns that have been problems, and I haven't really dealt with them much. I mean, one was a city that was in revolt, and I just stationed soldiers there, and that seemed to take care of it. And the other was one that was just not developing quickly, and I've just ignored it. I haven't had a problem, so I just let it be. I mean, this is in a level in which I have all of a continent, and so I've gotten to the point now that I've basically taken all the resources. So, and my workers are running out of things to do. They end up running all over the map, finding one tile somewhere where they haven't built a road, which we'll get to. But yeah, I basically haven't had any real issues with unrest. My cities are pretty closely nested together, and I keep taxes fairly low.
Mine
in
are
general.
Too. Yeah, well, maybe I'll look at the taxes, but the taxes are never what they're unhappy about. But and the overpopulation thing is weird to me, because I think I have enough. I don't know. Maybe I have too many cities in a small.
Close. Close. I mean, so they can't spread out.
Yeah, maybe that's.
Yeah, mine are not super tight to one another, except maybe that one that's having trouble developing maybe just can't grow bigger. Maybe that's its problem. I haven't really cared, because I've got problems trying to take Stavanger on that island. I want to keep it, but we'll get to all that anyway.
Yeah, so this episode we played through the medieval era. What's it called? Era? Phase?
Yeah, I think they're eras. Yeah.
So really, there's three main phases, I think, three main eras, right?
Right. We're heading into the industrial age. Right. I guess maybe they're called ages.
Age, yes, right, of course. Yeah, so basically, at least in my case, I've filled out two complete tech trees, and that's how they seem to trigger each of the end of the ages, or that you reach the next age is when you've. I don't think you have to fill the whole thing out, but you need one of your wings to get to the end of that. So,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah,
uh,
and those are basically usually governmental change. So I converted over to democracy, I guess. I think that was one of
yep,
the available endpoints. So I've converted to democracy, and I think that was basically the final stage of that. I feel like I had to backfill a little bit. Like I might have gotten to that really quickly, and had a few things that I had to go back and do, like astronomy or something, so I could have better navigation. I can't remember what order I did them in at this point, though. So yeah.
yeah. So I mean, I think one of the things that happens in this, at least for me, that I would bet is the case for most people playing, and you can corroborate that with me, is that because once you get into the medieval phase, you get into obviously another sort of whole layer of depth and complexity that starts happening, and then if you make it that far, I would assume that the other thing that starts happening that I'm experiencing is you get to a point of expansion where there's so many things going on at once, and you get into this very kind of micromanagey situation. And I assume obviously it just escalates from here into the industrial age too. But there's just so many buildings that for instance, that you can build inside your cities. There's so many types of units. You can upgrade units now. Um, you're starting to interact a lot more deeply with each of the other civilizations, whether it be trade based or diplomacy based or espionage or war. And I think as I played, I don't know, a handful of these games over the years, and I feel like I maybe I mentioned it in the first episode, but I always feel like it's a game that I would like to play, and so I always attempt playing them sort of every time a new one comes out, or I've stopped doing it, but in the old days, with every episode or with every version, I would usually buy it and try again. I'd try to hit my head against the wall again, and I remember now where I usually where I usually break down and essentially hit the wall that we always talk about, and it is around this age, because I think that the complexity of everything starts really hitting you hard, and I definitely appreciate some of the things, quality of life things that they probably started putting in around this version that we're playing, things like advisors, things like automating units and things like that, giving the player a lot more options as far as educating yourself, like we talked about with the Civilopedia. So there are answers out there, so to speak, but sometimes I just get overwhelmed. There's just so much going on, and this is my first Civ for this playthrough. I haven't bounced around. I think you've done a little bit bounce around or started over or something like that, and I'm trying to just I've reloaded maybe one or two saves that have gone poorly, but for the most part, I'm trying to just make the most out of this one. And so it is very much it's interesting that it seems like it is a game. If you really want to sink deeply into it, it's really trial by fire. You have to play a lot, I think, to get over that hump that I always hit. Um, just through the complexity of the systems. There's just so much going on.
There is a lot going on. I find that I don't particularly care for that tedium,
Yeah.
and I don't find that those decisions are necessarily all that interesting to me, at least under the sort of pressure that this civilization in particular is under, which is to say, not a lot, because I took out the one other civ on my continent early.
Hmm.
So I basically don't have a lot to worry about, because through the medieval ages, none of the ships until very late in the medieval ages can reach other continents, because there's dangerous waters. They don't travel very fast, etc. I sent out some boats just out of curiosity, like what's going to happen if I send this boat, and they sank. So
Yeah.
I sent them empty. I just sent them just like, what? Okay, I can build the boat now. What can I do with it? Okay, it goes a little ways and then it sinks. Is basically what I can do with it. So I need to research these technologies and things like that. So I have no real simulation pressure on me other than internal strife to my civilization. So whether that's some of the pressures we talked about pre-show of, well, my citizens aren't happy or whatever for different reasons, and I mostly don't worry about that too much. I sort of internalize the fact that there's going to be more corruption further from my capital. So those places I definitely build courthouses in quickly, because anything that increases law and order is good. And then I focus on economic stuff pretty quickly. And then I have a smattering of like wonders and those sorts of things going at any given time. So whenever the sim is telling me, here's the breakdown of the civs in the world, I am the most cultured and my citizens are the happiest, and I don't know how we shake out in the power curve. I think we're doing pretty well. So I've had kind of a lucky break with this particular game, which makes me curious about how it will go if I start a new one on a harder level of difficulty. But basically, as far as the micromanaging goes, I basically make my decisions pretty quickly, and with any units that I've built, I kind of park them and hit the F key. I forget what that stands for, but it basically means
fortify.
Stand here. Yeah, fortify.
Yeah.
Hang out here. Just sit here. There's nothing else to do. There's no other enemies. So it's really just I'm amassing these in case somebody sends a boat to me first, but that really hasn't happened. So
yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, that very well may be having quite a big impact then, now that I think about it, as you're describing it. And I mean, one of the cool things about playing the game that I definitely want to do every episode for this series is to kind of swap stories about things that are going on. But maybe your stories aren't that interesting.
Not at this point.
If you've lucked out. Yeah, it's
my big story was eliminating the Egyptians, right? And since then it's been pretty autopilot-y. Like there just haven't been, like I said, there's not been a lot of interesting decisions, and there's not been a lot of times where I've gone, ooh, what am I going to do? When I go, what am I going to do? It's more, I don't understand the systems of the game, and I kind of have to figure out where the knobs are. For example, to lower taxes or whatever, or to increase or decrease the rate of research, or I mean, just all of those things. When you're an isolated civ on a huge continent, or I don't know about huge continent, but a third of the world, say, you kind of don't have any problems. So I don't know. That's kind of interesting, and a commentary in its own right, I guess.
So when you started, it was just you in Egypt on that continent?
Correct.
So you only had one. Okay, yeah, so that is a big. Yeah, because I have the Mayans and the Incans in the area with me, and we're all very in close proximity, and we have been from the beginning. And it's been really cool and interesting to see how. Yeah, I feel like we're playing very different games in some ways, because very simple things. I think I mentioned this last episode, like one individual iron mine becomes an enormous point of sort of resource contention for all three of us, and it becomes like a battleground, because there were only, I think, maybe 2 iron mines on the continent, and then I had both of them at one point, and lost one through a battle, through basically a war, declaration of war. And then we made a treaty after that, and I just gave it up because I had another one. The other one ran out of iron, which I didn't know was a thing. So I expended it basically. And so then I couldn't make those units. And so then I basically had to declare war back again on the Mayans and take it back. which I did succeed at, but it was just crazy to me that, we have this whole continent, and this iron mine is basically in the middle of the continent, surrounded by all three of us. So it's like, I don't know, there's probably some historical reference that we could make, that where there's some some
something
resource
analogous,
some analogous contention in history where that same thing happened. In fact, I'm sure there are probably thousands of them, but it was just such an interesting distillation of at least how conflict works in this game, because what ended up happening is, and because of the podcast, we're sitting down and we're, at least for me, I'm analyzing the systems much more than I would if I were just playing for fun, and more than I ever had for these games. And so when you sit down and you start like matrixing yourself into the spreadsheets that are playing behind the scenes, and I wanted to ask you later about, I forgot to tell you this in pre-show, but I wanted to talk, if you can, a little bit about AI for this game, because it's something that baffles me a little bit, and I'm be really interested to hear sort of even a high-level architectural thoughts on it. But that there's some variable that the Mayans had where they also realized that they could not make the units that they wanted to make, right? And that triggered them to go after the mine, because then they knew that it was there and that somebody else had it. And the other funny thing that's happening, I'm sorry, I'm jumping into some of the stories, but it'll kind of wrap back around to the systems. The other funny thing that happened in that spreadsheet for me is, for whatever, just through the luck of the die roll for the construction of the continent, I think for the whole map, like including both continents, I'm the only person that has spice. And I have 4 nodes of spice right in the middle of my territory. So nobody else has that, and everyone wants it. And I have a lot of it. And that just was, I didn't even know it was spice at the beginning of the game. I just kind of I built my cities, ended up having all of it. And it's just a luxury item, or whatever they call it. So it's not really like a resource, but it is something that people want.
Empires have risen and fallen over salt.
Exactly. And then I'm basically like the spice runner, not to make a Star Wars reference, but I'm like the
I was more thinking space lanes.
Space lanes.
Dune,
got it. Yeah, okay, of course.
Right. Those giant worm things, the spice is life, man. Yeah, spice is life.
Yeah. So how funny. Yeah. So it works on multiple levels. But something as simple as that, like literally the first time, and this was what caused the conflict for me with the Mayans originally, which is just such a funny sentence anyway. They wanted spice. And what the Mayan leaders said when they opened up negotiations was basically a threat. Give us some spice for free, or we will attack you. And basically in no uncertain terms, that's what he was saying. And I said, no, I'm not giving you spice for free. You can give me some money or whatever. I did some counter offers, and he declined all of them. So I was like, well, you're not getting spice. And then immediately he declares war on me, And so you start seeing the machine happening where it's just, some equation resulted in this. And now it sort of causes this cascading effect of going to war with your neighbor when you weren't ready to, you didn't want to, all because of the luck of how that spice, was placed on the map and where I was placed. Now I could have said yes, of course. And I think ultimately I'm trying to think, I think someone else America ended up asking me for spice. And that time I was like, yeah, you can have it for free. I'm not going to bother dealing with it. But it's just interesting how I guess I never had gotten to that point in previous attempts at playing these games where I could see such a contentious resource, become that important, because I just didn't make it that far, where people were running out of, they wanted to have more resource types, right? Or more luxuries or something. And so can you, not to put you on the spot, but can you talk about like the AI side of this at all?
It's kind of not, I've never done something quite like this, but I mean, basically what you would be doing is any number of sort of fitness functions, and then maybe some heuristics that are like personality based or something like that. So you might associate a characteristic with a civilization,
Yeah.
randomly or based on the original civilization type or whatever.
I think that seems clear. They're definitely like there seems
right
to
in
be
order to give them
persona.
the flavor, as it were, not to parrot. To pun on spice, but to give them a sense of the original civilization, I could see that maybe being a thing. We need the spice for our rituals, and that's probably a civilization that starts with burial, ceremonial burial, or something like that. But they need this resource to do it, or what have you. And I would think that as the tech tree progresses, there will be this need for those things, and what type of civilization they are might make them more demanding of it. So you have basically an option, and you're going to evaluate those things on some sort of fitness, like the fitness. You basically are you have a number of options, and you're going to score them based on some number of factors. So it might be, we might have three options. One is diplomacy, but backed by our strength. So we'll offer diplomacy because we know we have lots of units. So we'll just demand something for nothing, which is a pretty strong position to think that you're in. Versus, oh, actually we're weak, so maybe we'll offer something that we do have some of, whatever that is. Some technology. I've definitely had diplomacy offers of, hey, we'll give you this if you give us that. Although all of the offers tend to be pretty aggressive. I'm never sure about the relative weights of things, so I don't know. Like, how good is ceremonial burial versus the wheel? I don't know. Like, no idea what that means, right? I mean, it's not equivalent. It's impossible for me to decide. So it's almost like the AI has an advantage at that point, because it actually has some idea, because they had some ideas. They built the sim, how important it was to have wheels versus ceremonial burial.
Yeah, they put values on things, probably, right?
Right.
In the
Exactly. Yeah. So there is some value to all of those things, and something like spice. It's hard to know how deeply that winds its way into the simulation. Is it a thing that maybe they have? Maybe their civilization has population problems, that people are unhappy, and they want to give them spice as basically for food, or just they can't expand quickly enough. They need spice to expand. I don't know. Maybe that's salt as a preservative. Like, I don't know what spice is meant to represent. But it's a need that they can abstractly say, we need to have a certain amount of this to progress, however that happens. And so fulfilling that need is important. And based on other factors, personality versus relative strength, versus, I don't know, whatever else, they'll offer different things. Would be my guess, right? I mean, that would be how I would probably approach it naively, and off the top of my head.
I don't know. That makes sense. I think, like, the other sort of way to come at this point that I'm trying to make is when you look at something like spice specifically versus iron, which are two different, as you probably already know, and have discovered, they're very different types of resources, because I think the iron is considered a strategic resource, like horses are, or what have you, right? And I think what has been cool for me is looking at the tech tree, combining the tech tree with, essentially we're talking about layered design, or layered systems design here. So you have the tech tree, which is obviously just a flow chart with, data and value and things that are put to it. There's obviously, quote unquote, narrative behind that too, because there are descriptions about what things do, and you have some sort of, maybe you bring some of your own personal biases to it, like, I want to move toward a democratic society, though obviously you can win probably in any of them, because we live in a democracy, maybe, I don't know. But if you just strip all that stuff away and you just kind of look at the spreadsheet, there is a bit that needs to be flipped for you to achieve certain successes with certain technologies. And one is, if you want horsemen, you need to have horse as a strategic resource, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then if you want swordsmen, you need to have iron, and those all lead to greater and greater units from there. And so, and spice as a is a luxury resource, I think they call it, and that I think is largely. I mean, we'll have probably someone will send us corrections on this, but I think that largely is just focused on sort of happiness. Like you want more luxuries in your civilization, so people are happier. And so, to your point,
keeps the revolts down.
Yeah, if the Mayans, if there's some threshold number in the spreadsheet is passed of happiness, then they start seeking out ways to make that threshold go down or go below the threshold. And one of those ways is to find more luxuries. And then how do you find more luxuries that you don't have within your space? You ask others for it, and so to your point about like the aggressive bartering or bartering or deals or diplomacy that they're doing, I feel like I've found, at least for the most part, because I think for my size, I'm relatively powerful from a military perspective. So every time they threaten, like the Mayans did, threaten me to take spice, or they will attack, I did enough sort of espionage or what have you to know that we are either fairly equally powerful from a military standpoint, or I'm more powerful. And I have yet to have somebody actually come be aggressive with me that is more powerful. You know what I mean? So it's like, I don't know if that's by design because they want you to get into, conflict to expend resources or something like that. But I'm always surprised because like, how are you threatening me right now? Because you don't really have the backing to do it. But the other variable that you mentioned up top is there could be more to, and I'm sure people have researched this, or maybe it's even in the manual, there could be more to the personas for each leader or civilization, and
right.
Not to pigeonhole the Mayans, but maybe the Mayans are more of an aggressive society that are going to be more, they'll have more bravado over,
Yeah, it's funny because that wouldn't be what I would associate with the Mayans. But again, I don't know how that's drawn out. I mean, I think of the Aztecs, the Incans, and the Mayans, and I'm like, well, the Incans, they had human sacrifice, so they're the most aggressive. And the Aztecs, I know they were pretty warlike. The Mayans, I think of as being pretty agrarian and peaceful.
Yeah.
But that's my 30-plus-year-old memory of Civ 1 from freshman year of high school, right? I mean, that's literally how far back we're going to my understanding of the Mayans.
On the flip side, like every time I've interacted with Abe Lincoln, and maybe they're biases for me in this, of course, he feels like he's always acting in a fairly Abe Lincoln-y kind of way or democratic kind of way, or very like not passive, but not in an aggressive manner. You know what I mean? And obviously this was made by Americans, so that could be another, bias that they've put on. And I think there's a lot more inner turmoil that I'm having playing the game than I guess I thought I would have. You know what I mean? With how things are represented. Because they're having to boil down civilization, like one of the most complex things that humans have ever created. They're trying to boil it down into a video game. And for anyone with even slightly a bit of critical thinking about it, if you think too hard about it, like it breaks down in so many ways.
Oh, yeah, it absolutely does. I mean, we have a lot of feedback about this because of our discussion of colonialism and eliminating the barbarians. Mm-hmm. I mean, a lot. We have a couple that are on both sides of this issue, so I will maybe leave some of that to feedback.
Okay.
But I feel the same way, and I'm going to have to sort of defend some of my opinion about that, which is good. I mean, it's worth interrogating yourself about. But I'm the same way. I'm pretty uncomfortable. I've actually been pretty happy to have a game in which, sure, I early on eliminated a civilization, which doesn't feel great. But but then I was just alone. And that's been kind of nice that I can just sort of see the mechanisms, even though it does make it kind of dull.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's like, yes, but I don't have to go kill another civilization. I can just sit here and let them kill each other. I think there's 4 or 5 civs on my planet in that game currently.
Yeah.
So I've got some time. I've got like a third maybe of the population on the planet already. So
Holy
they
cow.
must
Yeah.
be fighting each other,
It's
and
so different. Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
oh yeah, yeah, hugely different. Like I could tell from my first game, it was going to be stressful, and I think it's really important for me to go back to that very first game. I still have those saves, and maybe play some others, maybe play some different difficulty levels, just to kind of feel out other. I'm not going to play on the hardest ones, but I do want to sort of see
Mm-hmm.
how aggressive and just try different strategies, even from the early game, from the same save. Like, what if I accept the diplomatic offers versus go to war? What if, etc. What if I, pull back my units, and even though I'm at war, I'm not out there trying to take things, trying to take territory. I'm just kind of turtling. Um, I don't really know what the variables are in the combat, like what the strategy should be. So there's a lot, and that's just one aspect of the game. There's so much to explore. I mean, on the one hand, I feel kind of pretty squicky about the whole thing at times, and then on the other, it's is kind of somewhat entrancing how much stuff there is. I mean, I just can't imagine balancing a game like this
Yeah.
um, across multiple levels of difficulty and all the different ways that the civ and the sim can be built. So, however they're personifying these civilizations versus how they uh, how they build the map, right? It's a small, medium, large map, lots of barbarians, not many barbarians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like it's a lot to balance. And it's kind of astonishing to even really think about how to, how to build this game. It's a
Yeah.
lot.
Playtesting alone. Yeah. I mean, I think, we talked about sort of the legacy of this series in particular and them, they're on the 6th version now. And I think if there's ever been a series that benefits from iteration, and commitment to that iteration, it's kind of nice for them and for us as an industry that they have been successful because it's allowed them to keep making them, and I
Mm-hmm.
can only imagine, like, I think we read in our minimal amount of research from last episode, we mentioned that I think this is the first one where they started really leaning into culture as a bigger aspect of the game. And that's
Right,
also a way that you can win the game, and I
right,
can only imagine, through one and two that probably I'm going to guess that military conflict was probably a very primary focus. And I know that in 6 they've added even more where they have sort of religion plays a bigger role rather than just being sort of like a stop along the way on the science, which is also weird on the science
yeah,
tree.
track, yeah, yeah,
It's like, oh yeah, the all the religious stuff is on the science track. But so it's nice, that they've been able to expand that and give you different options. And I finally, as you mentioned last episode, I didn't really look at it very much. I finally looked at the victory screen because I need to I need to kind of start planning to see if I am going to actually win this one. And it's going to be tight because I didn't realize that there was a turn limit. Of course there is, if there's got to be an
oh,
end. And so I looked at the
I
turn
forgot there's
limit.
a turn limit.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't
And
know
so
where I am on that. Oh my goodness, yeah.
I think in my game, which I would assume if we're on the same difficulty, it's probably around the same if we all did random.
It's
But
the easiest
yeah,
difficulty. Yeah.
yeah. So my turn limit is like 540 turns, and I think I'm at like 417 or something. So that doesn't sound like a lot for me to actually do what I need to do. And so it basically at least, to give them credit, at least I'm looking at that screen and there's like whatever 5 different ways that you can win, and you can kind of start, if your focus really is about winning, which I guess this is a good kind of game to not really have that be your focus, which is kind of cool. You don't really, obviously everyone wants to win, but maybe some people just want to play. But if I do want to, I can now strategize about how I'm going to do that and which ones, like for instance, the culture one, I didn't actually check the box for wonders, which you said you did. So that's not an option.
I did in one, and in this one that I've made to end of the medieval ages, I did not. So okay. I have one of each.
Yeah, so that's not an option for me. But culture, I think I'm not even close. I think maybe population I could, but I will have to take out the Mayans and the Incans to do it. And so, so then I'm now thinking, okay, if that's the way that I have to do it, then I'm going to need to focus on military more than I wanted to. Even though I really enjoy, though it's fairly light touch, I really enjoy the science aspect of it. I don't think I think America is too far ahead as far as science goes, so I won't catch up. But yeah, it's interesting to see, I guess, to sort of riff off of that and to hit another topic, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
The other thing that I've enjoyed doing that I will give them a lot of credit for, and I think it's just been because, like I said earlier, I haven't really been analyzing it ever before when I played these until we're playing it for the podcast, how much they've really obfuscated from the player the sort of simplicity of each individual system. Now, like you said, like we both said, there's a lot of complexity that's happening, but I think it's really more of a clash of a bunch of simple systems than it is complex systems that make that complexity, if that makes sense. Each individual thing. So if you look at the science tech tree, so I'll take 2 examples. One, the simplicity of the science tech tree it's not as complicated as I thought it was, I think, when I played these in the past. You can really just kind of boil things down into, like we said, what strategic resource do you need? What's the previous science that you've researched to lead to that point? And then essentially, the resources you have on the map and the population in form of the shields, essentially what your capacity is. And then you have that combined with essentially the system of what I would call the land mass. And that is really dictating sort of space and sort of unit control, and then obviously conflict with other, because as we know with the Earth, space is a resource, and that does create
not making
conflict.
More of it.
Right. And so that's ends up being a lot of what the conflict is. And so they have appropriately sort of simulated some of that stuff in a really, really, really distilled way. But if you really like break it down, it's not that complex, like there's not that many nodes on a map, but they interweave with the science tech tree just enough to where you think like you're overwhelmed. You know what I mean? But if you just if you take a breath and you take a step back and you think, okay, any little tile on the science tech tree that's red, that's a strategic resource. There's only, I don't know, like on every age, there's only a few. So it's like, and you can't even see them until you research that science anyway. So it's, once you sort of start, again, seeing that spreadsheet, it really breaks down at least some of the anxiety that I was having for the complexity that I mentioned earlier. And I really give them credit for doing a great job of having these simple systems, but clashing them in interesting and sort of seemingly more complex ways. It's just the sort of the multiplying effect of that, which I think is like the bread and butter of good systems design. I don't think any good systems design needs to be complex, and it shouldn't be, especially in a game. But the beauty of it is really when you have those things, those simple things clashing together. Because when if you show somebody this game who has never played it or doesn't play sim games, I'm sure that they're, especially with all the menus, their head would explode. You know what I mean? They're just like, so how could you ever play this game? It's so complex and blah, blah, blah. But once you get into it for a little while, and you start, again, getting over those cool humps of like, you overcome an adversary, or you overcome some sort of like situation that you were presented with, even if it wasn't war, and then you've had that win, it's like, oh, okay, I get it. Oh, okay, I get it. And you have more and more of those. So
and I think it's possible to be fairly intuitive about that as well. For example, when I started this game, I didn't even know that it was just me and another civ on this one continent, but I did see that I was near pretty much a choke point as far as, I mean, it was a pretty wide section of map, but I was looking at the section of map where I started and saying, oh, well, it's not that far from sea to shining sea. So I could conceivably block off the middle here and push in one direction or the other and see what kind of pushback I got.
Yeah.
Right. And as it turned out, I could, I just sort of ran warriors in both directions just to see what was there. And I had basically penned in Egypt to the smallest part of the map, right? I happened to just pen them in, and they couldn't safely go through my territory. I think the AI doesn't like to go through your territory if it can help it. So early on, it might feel more strongly about that. They certainly don't like it when you go into their territory. So they immediately will say, hey, you're in my space.
Well, there's a diplomatic agreement you can have, right, where freedom of travel is something you can choose to do, but I think you have to choose to do it.
Oh, I've definitely never chosen that. Right, yeah. All these options are there for sure, but I've had rulers say, hey, you're moving through my space, and I'll just ignore them. And sometimes it'll come to the point where they say, well, can't ignore it anymore. You're not allowed to just ignore it. And your war advisor will say, well, what are you going to do here, really? And I'll say, you're right. Let's take them out. And that's basically what happened to Egypt. Yes, I want to get to those resources on the far side of Egypt. Oh, well, tough luck for Egypt. As it turned out, there weren't any. They were at the far southern end of this continent. But, oh well, I didn't know that until I started walking through their lands. And they started complaining. But, but it's the thing is the thing that bothers me about it, is that I calculate things that way.
Yeah.
Like that's what I'm kind of forced to do. That there's not.
You can game it. You can min-max it.
Right? Yeah, you can min-max it, and also I'm just not. I mean, I shouldn't. There's a degree to which I'm like, yeah, they're not. These aren't people, right? But also at the same time, it's like, ugh, it's just not great. I don't know. This one. I mean, I feel like the earlier, as you already pointed out, the earlier you go in this series, the more it is a domination game. As a number of board games around this topic are, like a diplomacy or a risk or whatever is about amassing armies and taking over the world. Basically, these games end by eliminating other players, right? And so, I don't know. I think that's been one of the things about this genre that's made it always not my thing.
Yeah.
Like, I don't feel that way about turn-based role-playing games. I mean, we've played like Fallout or whatever. Or any number. I mean, I've certainly played them for years, or I did play them for years. I don't really play them anymore. And it just never bothered me that it's essentially the same thing. But there's this story, and there's this, good and evil, and there's, whatever. I mean, there's, I'm not fighting other humans. I'm fighting orcs, or I'm fighting gnolls, or, whatever. I mean, or I'm fighting super mutants, etc. And I just kind of like, oh, okay, then that's fine then. So the fantasy trapping helps me a lot. I don't know.
Too. Yeah, no, But I think that I agree. I mean, that is important. Like the context for your adversaries is critical to all of this, I think, and I think what especially in the more modern versions, as I think we maybe hit this a little bit in the first episode, but I think what Firaxis would probably say is that, it's your choice, right? How you deal with this stuff. Right. And, but it's, I mean, this is a deep topic. So I don't know how far we want to go into it. And it sounds like with letters, we'll get to a little bit of it, but there's still, you're still presenting, like you said earlier, like they're not really people. But the thing is another note that I put down that we don't have to hit hard is, there's writing to this game, right? They've put characterizations to the people. They put faces to the names of the people, right? Especially in the form of the leaders. And so I just don't think you can have your cake and eat it too.
That's always been weird. I mean, I think that's also meant to be sort of tongue-in-cheeky, humorous, satirical, right? I mean, I think it's like, oh, you might have Gandhi and he might go to war with you, right? And you have the warlike Gandhi. I mean, I can remember that even being a feature of their advertising, even. So there's like there's even a Bill and Ted's caricature nature to the characters, where they are saying the things that they might say, but in a context that doesn't make any sense, right?
Oh, for sure.
So there's that. There's that cheeky
good example.
Well, yeah, one of my favorite movies. So, it's just so tongue in cheek, right? I mean, it's meant to be absurd and I think distract to some degree, or just to say, hey, don't take this too seriously.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I mean, it's like other games. I mean, The Sims is not a sim like this is, but still a simulation game. And those games, they play up the kind of comical nature of the things that they've chosen to simulate. Like your character has to go to the bathroom, they pee on the floor, right? Because you didn't get around to, cleaning the bathroom or whatever it is you're supposed to do in the game. Or you can put them in the pools and take all the ladders out, or they'll set the kitchen on fire, it's just, it's meant to create this distance. It's weird. I mean, it's just such a weird space that these games live in that wants to keep it fun, while at the same time, as we talked about last time, the title is Civilization. It's The Sims, which makes it sound like it's a family named The Sims who live next door, right? I guess Phil Simms, the NFL quarterback, it's his family.
That would be, I want to play that game. It's a game,
a mod.
Simulating his family. That's it.
Yeah. It's like the Osbournes, but it's, but it's just this one specific family. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, I just, yep. I mean, I think that it's an interesting, just for the sake, I think, of the podcast and sort of the way that we try to, delve deeply into things. My final thought on that is interesting to talk about for the podcast without getting too sort of in our own sort of personal opinions about things anymore, at least for myself. It's interesting to me that the value of putting context, and I'm saying that broadly because they do it in various ways, the value of putting context into the game about things you're interacting with, whether it be a unit or a leader or a city. Again, last episode, we talked about something as simple as naming the city after a city that has connotations to it. It's just been interesting to me that the value of that is so great on the positive side, because it immediately gives you a recognition versus a science fiction or fantasy location,
right,
of what it is. You put meaning to it, you put value to it. Like Seattle, right? Like I would fight for Seattle. I live in Seattle, so like there's certain connotations. But then on the flip side of that, it also brings in the cons to that, right? As soon as and the example I told Brett in the pre-show to share with the podcast, the two top civilizations, I think I'm probably roughly ranked at number 3 in my game right now. The two top civilizations are America and the Iroquois. And they're on the same continent. And you know what I mean? And so that's crazy, especially with Brett's point last time where Seattle is named as an American city, but is, a Native American indigenous name, so it's just, and they can't, they'd be paralyzed if they were to try to fix all of those sorts of challenges with making the game. But I guess I just never thought about it enough, from before.
I mean, lots of board games are like this, right? That even if they have different sort of fantasy settings, I mean, you put people into competition, and you're going to have this natural sense of, well, I'm going to take some of the space of the map, or I'm going to take some of the resources of the map, so that I will score more points than you and therefore win. And as you said, the sort of fantasy, as fantasy one, maybe you have to do more work to explain, or you can have fewer connotations going in about what those things mean. I mean, we play Dominion, for example, a card game, and that's the whole game is about, taking up all the resources, which is explicitly land. Land that costs more has a higher point value at the end. And there's some different sort of natural balancing factors in that game. It's a card game as well, so it's a little bit different. But I mean, it's the same. The same is true all over the place. And I don't know. I think it's the explicitly the sort of roots of this being so focused on the combat and having this skinning on it is just the thing that that weirds me out.
The colonialization of it, yeah. I mean, it's boiled down through the necessity of what type of civilization story they're trying to tell, or simulation they're trying to tell. I mean, you mentioned Risk earlier, but Risk I think has always been an interesting one for me too, because we immediately, and I think it applies to civilization in this conversation, because we've always had context to the board in that game, because the countries are, the locations that you're playing upon, and Australia is like the best example, right? Small but separate, right? And there's always that sort of like early moment where like, well, who's gonna start on Australia, and then there's some jokes that fly about them doing that, but then sometimes the people that start in Australia, actually benefit from that. But then we have this sort of like, again, it's context for what Australia is, in the real world, right? Or what China is in the real world, or what the US is. And so, and how the map, like the design of the planet and the continents, impact the design of that game has always fascinated me.
Right.
Where things
I mean, I sort of feel the same way. Another game, I don't know if you ever played it this was a computer game, as a Chris Crawford game, was Balance of Power.
No, I never did, but I've always heard of it.
Yeah, so that's a game that is about the Cold War and basically the influence of your ideology across the world. And you sort of have these different ways that you can intervene in locations. You can do economic interventions of different kinds, both pro and con, but you can also send in advisors. And so basically you're trying, military advisors, basically, which are code name for, in Vietnam, it was like, well, we sent in military advisors. Look how that turned out. But that's what it's reflecting, is a much different sort of approach to the world. It's a much more narrow time frame as well. It's during the time of nukes between superpowers, so it's not trying to cast as wide a net. But one of the things I really appreciate about that game is if you get into significant armed conflict and it escalates, you lose. That's not a good end condition. Whereas, in Civilization, that's one of the primary means of winning the game. And I guess that's one of the reasons why it's always made, just rubbed me the wrong way. But at the same time, like as a person who plays board games, I'm astonished at the achievement of balancing all of these different things. And I think, as you pointed out, the layering does a lot of good work there, but also just to make as complicated and convincing an AI about, with this game is it's all just kind of fascinating and is in itself an achievement.
For sure. Yep. And it sucks you in. Like we were talking about in pre-show too, but it's fascinating to me how hours just go by playing this game, even with some of the challenges that I have with it, it's definitely sucks you in. And I think it's just the 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 sort of how it welcomes you to sort of into the micromanagement of the world. You know what I mean? There's always something popping up, and there's always something to click on and something to do, and it's always seems like you're impacting something. You know what I mean? You have an impact
Right.
every turn, and it's really just the scale of it that ends up sort of. But you're dealing with the similar questions throughout the whole time. Other than maybe the early game is sort of more exploration based, but once everything's explored and you kind of see where everybody is, you're just kind of trying to expand at that point, I feel like, and beat the clock.
I think there's some good choices here as well that lead to the sorts of things that you see happening in other games. For example, I've mentioned a couple cities that I've been having trouble with, and one is Thebes. And Thebes, that's that one that just can't quite figure its stuff out in terms of expanding and being able to have a larger population and do more, pull more of its weight in the civilization. And that's just one of those things that I think naturally happens in Sims, where you start to, Thebes will have a problem again. You'll shake your head and be like, "Yep, it's always Thebes, isn't it?" Right? And you just you build up these associations with your own places on the map, which is really powerful. It's like hating specifically Donkey Kong in this one set of races you're doing in Mario Kart because he keeps coming from behind at the last second and deploying whatever, a blue shell at the worst possible time or whatever, and pulling ahead just before the finish line or whatever. And you curse that character, and then the next time it's Toad, and then the time after that it's Luigi, right? It's got nothing to do with something intrinsic about that character or that name of that city. It's just, as it turned out, this time Thebes has been a problem, right? So it's got like nice little eddies in the problems are just a little thorny, and you're maybe stretched a little too thin to deal with any of them. Like I said, Thebes, I think, might have too much pressure from the cities around it that grew faster. And it's next to some mountains, so maybe it's not allowed to grow as fast. Like I don't know how it actually works to make those determinations, but I can tell you that right, Thebes is giving me these troubles, and that's interesting and good. I mean, I think those are the sorts of things that I think that like legacy board games are trying to do, and that we're kind of off on a total tangent, but like a Pandemic Legacy or even Risk Legacy is another good example. They have things that change about the board over time, and they are basically making adjustments to the board that reflect what happened in your actual game. So, we lost this city forever, for example. This city is in ruins, and nobody can live there. Everybody died or whatever. There was some huge epidemic breakout there, and that's it for that city ever. But that's different for every player, or, potentially different for every player. All of that's super interesting. And that's kind of what those games are trying to reflect, those legacy games. So I think it just kind of naturally happens in a well-balanced simulation that you have these problem children in your cities or whatever. I just can't, it happens with everything. We see patterns even if they aren't there. And we make stories out of them. So, I bought this card in Dominion, but I never got to play it because it was always coming up when it's like it was married to that other card. You just kind of spin these stories to yourself.
I think that's one of the great things about sim-centric games in general is
all that randomness and all the simulations lead to these wild stories.
I mean, they all of the sims that we've anything that like this XCOM whatever that we've talked about that have some sim qualities do give context to, like, a base amount of context, like aliens are invading or what have you, but then the rest of the context comes from the player, and I think that's what's so awesome. I wonder if maybe this, because I have unfortunately yet to play a legacy board game, which I really am bummed about because I really want to. I've heard so many, they sound so interesting. I wonder how much they have been influenced by video games, and the concept of permanence in in video games. If that's something that they were inspired by, I don't know. I haven't heard or read anything about that, but
I feel like they were, although not. So Rob Daviau he was one of the legacy. He designed
he's the main one.
Risk. He's kind of the well-known people in legacy games, and I think he also worked with the Pandemic legacy designer, whose name is not coming to me at the moment. Leacock, I think. Anyway, he gave a talk at Practice in 2013 or 14, might be online, and I'll put it in the show notes if I can find it. But he talked about basically trying to break the rules about board games. So finding like sort of unwritten higher level rules, not the rules of a specific game. But one of the things about board games is like, oh, you start from scratch every time.
Yeah.
And so that was the primary sort of assumption about board games that he re-examined. And that's how he got to legacy games. So I don't think it video games may have informed that he thought of ways to actually do that. But that was not sort of his primary motivator, from what I recall.
Cool.
So it'd be interesting to watch that talk again. It's been, 6 or 7 years since I saw him speak about it. So,
cool.
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, we're here at an hour. I have no idea. When I produce this, I'll have to figure out what we actually talked about to move other topics to next week. But we'll come back to them, and we should instead turn to feedback. I believe I gave you an email that was disconnected from the others, and then we have a couple that are related. So why don't you go ahead with the first one I gave you?
Okay, this one. Okay, yeah, Civ 3.
Yep.
Jaffool. Civ 3 from Jaffool. Like it. Nice choice. I love the series. I believe Civ 3, maybe 4, had a great tool I believe later versions lost. There's a diplomacy wheel with icons for every civilization that draws lines between them to denote contract, trade, alliance, and war. Unless I'm mistaken, the latest games don't have it, making determining military and alliance decisions incredibly cumbersome to me. Or maybe I just got old and like things my way. It's incredibly interesting how series like this change over time to retread the same ground through new eyes. Love the podcast. Hope things are well for you both. I don't believe that. I guess it depends on what he means by wheel. There is a screen that has some lines being drawn between civs, but I have to admit I haven't deciphered it yet. But
I think this is one of those things where if you play it more, you might rely on that more to sort of have a quick view of what's going on. I did find that screen in the first game I was playing, and I was only in contact with 2 other Sims at the time, and it sort of was like, oh, this line is basically like, hey, you know about each other. And I could see that being really valuable in a game where you are surrounded on all sides and have had to play nice because you don't have the resources, and maybe for whatever reason you have some wealth or something like that. So like I could see it being really useful to be like, well, where am I with these folks, and be able to see that at a glance. I haven't had much need for it, but it is, I think, generally talks to especially in long running series, depending on where we come into it, we might associate that one as being the one.
It happens.
Final Fantasy IX is the first Final Fantasy I played. Still my favorite. As another example. I can't believe I ever would have loved Final Fantasy VIII more than the others. Yeah, come at me. I said it. But yeah, I mean, I sort of like, I can see just, I learned to play and leverage this information in this way, and they took it away. would be a tough sell for me.
Oh yeah, don't get me started on that topic.
Yeah.
For my own development.
I was going to say, I can just imagine. I have one here from Sam Thomas, which says Civ 3 is just the subject. He says, I really enjoyed the first episode and your thoughts on the Civ series. Though I'm glad you brought up the Western lens the developers used. In the end, I felt you were a bit unfair to them. We're going to have 2 emails here that we'll read and then discuss that are kind of on either side of this. Game development is difficult enough, and expecting lay people, history-wise, to be forward-looking about the lens they use to examine history is a bit much. It would be hard enough to be woke enough to realize that you should, and then the challenges of understanding enough of the world's diverse history to put together a coherent game would likely have doomed Civ to development hell. At least they didn't go full cringe by making the European Civ stronger than the others. I'm not sure that Civ 6 does any better on the Western lens test. I did appreciate your point about naming the game Civilization, and it's interesting to note the apt name of the game, Europa Universalis. I also wanted to share my childhood memory of playing Civ 2. In that game, when you build a wonder, you get a full motion video, often with clips from real life. These made my imagination go wild and filled me with a sense of wonder. Unfortunately, this was only done in Civ 2, and later games used different techniques. I wish they would bring this back. He gives a couple of YouTube examples that I'll put in the show notes. He says it's interesting to note that the list of wonders from Civ 2 are 95% Western, proving your point and showing that I'm full of it. Thanks for the great podcast and game on, Sam. P.S. I'm available to do a show with Brett while Tim's on the hike. So anyway, why don't you read yours as the other side of this, and then we can talk about those things.
Developers in the 90s, Esther Olson. Dear Brett, specifically this is addressed to Brett, just to be clear. Not everything is nuanced and complex. Some things are extremely simple and uncontroversial in all times, including the era of microprose. For example, there are a couple simple things we teach kindergartners that most people agree on: stealing, bad; killing, bad; invading other people and taking their stuff by force. That's villain stuff. Therefore, when you say it's a lot to ask 90s Sid Meier not to drink the Kool-Aid when it comes to colonialism, I disagree. We need to lay to rest the argument that people in the past didn't know better, because it's not a lot to ask of a grown man to grasp the concept you teach to kindergartners. Regards, Esther.
Oh. Okay, so we have 2 people on different sides of the colonialism argument in a way, I guess. I mean, Sam saying, hey, maybe you should give them a break, and Esther saying you absolutely should not.
Love it.
And I kind of figured that this would happen because it's definitely one of those things that is hard to talk and think about. And when I said that it was nuanced, I meant the decisions, like how you come to some of the decisions that were made. I mean, we specifically were talking a lot about the barbarians and how they're not tribes that can get established into actual civs. They just are kind of there as early game cannon fodder. And as one example, I can imagine that being a late development addition where it's like, oh, the early part of the game is too hard. We need to have another way to inject money into the system, for example. And being like, well, what do we do? and back in the 90s, it would have been a pretty short development cycle. And being like, well, instead of just kind of putting gold out there for everybody to fight over, we'll have something that kind of can continually reestablish itself. So it would make sense for that to be some barbarians, I guess. I could see that maybe being a way it happened. I don't know, but it's like, they could have gone that way. We play these games sort of linearly, but we don't know in what way they were put together, right?
Yeah.
So that's one thing I sort of had in mind. There's other sort of interpretive stuff that we can get into. But for example, Civilization as a title could be ironic. I suspect not, but I don't know that's not the case. I mean, it could be like the aristocrats, right? I mean, that this is quote unquote civilization, right? And that's another possible interpretation. We don't have anything to suggest that that's the case, but it's a possible read. Not a strong case probably for that, but there are a lot of different ways. And then the final thing I guess I would say, and this would draw on kind of my own history and learning, is it's kindergartner stuff to say you don't kill and steal and what have you, but we don't teach early civilization in the terms that we teach kindergartners basic rules, right, about how to live with other people. We don't say, the Romans killed all the Minoans. We say the Minoans withered away. Or, the Minoans clashed with the Romans. And we don't say, and the Romans went into their little villages and killed them all, right? I mean, there's like this this sort of
history.
Yeah. There's this historical remove, but I mean, presentationally, like when we talk about these things as, for us ninth graders probably, or maybe a little earlier, we talk about it in an abstract way so as not to be too upsetting, I guess. Like, I don't really know what the thinking is, but I have to say, especially post, I think the internet has opened up a lot of this, and that these sorts of things are discussed a lot and you're exposed to a lot more. I didn't really have a sense, to pick something else, I didn't really have a sense of the real, like, moment-to-moment, day-to-day horrors of slavery, chattel slavery in the United States, which you would think would be a big part of what they teach us in school. I didn't have a sense of that economic system and how debasing and degrading and horrible it was, literally horrible in a moment-to-moment, day-to-day sense, until I was probably in my 30s.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't talk about it in the sense we probably should when we're younger, when we're teaching kids about what happened in the United States. When we talk about westward expansion in the United States, we talk about this thing called manifest destiny, right? Which was this idea, was like, this was meant to be ours, right? And that was how it was basically justified in the 19th century. And I remember manifest destiny. We spent probably a week talking about that and westward expansion, and probably, an hour of class talking about, the causes of the Civil War, right? And I just would say there's a lot of issues that make it hard to view that way. And I think you have to do a lot of work on your own to read between the lines of what they're telling you. And it's a lot to ask of somebody, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I will stand by saying it was nuanced. I agree. It's not complicated if you boil it down to what actually happened. I just think it's easy to not have it boiled down for you in America, and especially pre-internet America.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other side of it is Esther makes the point of sort of things that are taught in kindergarten, and those sort of the basic sort of humanity of those sorts of lessons. But I mean, I think there's also, to sort of as a partner to your point about how history is written and taught to especially younger kids, there is another side of it of some history does have to be, there's the basics of stealing is bad, killing is bad, but there's also, I think, lessons to be learned about why certain people were taken advantage of or killed throughout history, even if it is written in a better way. And not by the one who wins, which a lot of our history books and kids, dealing with a daughter in high school, I know, and we talk about all the time about what she's being taught versus what may have actually happened. My wife's really good at that. And, but at the same time, you do need to eventually get into the whys behind some of that stuff so that the kids, when, and I think kindergarten's too young, but I think maybe earlier than we do now, to Brett's point, is definitely needed. But you still have to hit it with some different perspectives, so you get the nuances of why some of that stuff was happening, so it isn't repeated, ideally in the future, or people can learn from those. But yes, at the core of those things, it is always stealing is bad, killing is bad. but I still think there's value in some of the historical context for why those events happened. And I'm not saying that that's what Civilization as a game is trying to do, to educate people. There is education in the game, but it's a simulation, so it's not unless you're playing one of the scenarios that they sometimes ship with, like expansion packs and stuff, which are trying to simulate real events.
Yeah, specific events. Yeah,
specific events. Their whole bread and butter is they're just throwing these things together, and then it's going to come out how it's going to come out, right? Gandhi could be a world conquering leader through military means, and to Brett's earlier point, there's that tongue in cheek there. So, it is, that's the rub of games sometimes in general, because a lot of games involve killing, and there's a lot that goes into that debate about, how as a player you handle that and how you've been educated and taught. And to the only other point I'll throw out there that relates to both of these points for me, and I don't know, I think you feel this way, Brett, but I think one of the things that I do enjoy about the podcast is, both of us can sit back and play a game and get super geeked out and super, in the weeds on a specific analysis of a game in a way that we don't get to at work. We don't get the luxury of, and I think Civilization is an amazing game. Civ 3 is an amazing game. And, but I still think in the podcast, we have the luxury of being critical of it. And it's the only one of the few times we actually have, the ability to do that. And I think to the other letter's point, yes, give them a break to some degree, but I think I think Brett agrees with me that we both believe so much in our medium and in our livelihood that I think every day we should always try to find ways to make it better, make the messages we give better in the games that we play, and to evolve. And, the podcast, luckily for us, the podcast is a place where we can do that. And, if we were, and the other way to say what I'm saying is, if I were in their shoes making Civ, I can't say I would have made different decisions. You know what I mean? Because you're in the middle of it, and you are trying to ship a game, and you are trying to make calls. And I would like to think that I would make some different decisions, but it's not the same as sitting on a podcast and being academic about it, which I do enjoy as well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things about simulations is that a simulation inherently makes a kind of argument.
Yes, right.
It's we call it kind of broadly procedural rhetoric, right? Is that the way that it works is making an argument for things, and I think that that's easier to see in hindsight than it is in the moment of actually making it. And our pressures are different today than they were in 1991 or 2001. We're much more pressured now by the sort of momentum of budget and how many people are committed to doing things a way that you made a decision about some time ago, and how hard it is to change those decisions. It maybe was somewhat easier to change those decisions to some degree from that standpoint in the past, but the timelines were much shorter. So you needed to, I'm sure there were plenty of times where earlier developers are just going, well, that's as good as we can do because we have to ship in 6 weeks. 6 weeks from now, we can't do something better than what we have. And maybe we come back to it in a later game. I mean, I think that that's one of the things that's interesting about the Civilization series itself is it has come back to the same thing again and again and again and broadened out what it wants to say about what I would still say is Western civilization, although I haven't played other titles in the series, so I can't really speak to that too much. But I think the fundamental sort of competition over scarce resources is a tough problem to simulate, especially if you want to give it a historical bent. Yeah. I mean, it is a fact that the Romans dominated, a certain part of the world for a certain period of time, to pick, one civilization in particular. The Byzantine Empire did as well, right? And so did China. And what's that?
No, I said, hey now, because I'm the Byzantines.
Yeah, I know you're the Byzantines. So if you're trying to, that's another sort of thing that you might be trying to do. You're trying to reflect history through your procedural rhetoric. It's like, well, this did happen, right? Regardless of whether it's good or bad, it did happen.
Yeah.
And so there's also that, is that this is a mirror to history. So it's not trying to propose the way it should have gone necessarily, although it can propose some other ways it might have gone. It is, however, holding up a mirror to what actually did happen to some degree, with as much nuance as they could do with simulation fidelity of each decade, that this simulation has come out, or each half decade, or whatever it is. So I don't know. Those are just a lot of thoughts about what I meant when I said it's nuanced. Was not colonialism is nuanced. Colonialism is bad, but making a simulation game about it, or about the way it has happened in history, is, I think, a little bit more complicated. That's what I was trying to get at. Yeah. But yeah, you're totally right about day-to-day development and how close you are to a thing, and how much time or ability you have to even make a decision under that. So,
after last episode, I had a thought that I forgot about until just now, as we were talking about this. So maybe saying it on air, it'll force me to actually do it this time. I wanted to do some research to see, because gaming is so big in China, for instance, and there's a lot of games that we don't get, of course, coming over here as localized. I wanted to actually see, though, obviously, if it's a web page in Chinese or something that I can't read very easily, then I might not be able to actually succeed at this goal. But I wanted to see if there are any civ type games that are actually published, in the East, that have a different perspective because of where they were built, and see if there's a way to, compare at all, to see if there's any differences. So if anyone knows of them out there, if they do speak Mandarin or Cantonese or what have you, or there could even be, a Eastern European version. I know some of those are localized and they are quite big in the West. They get over to the West, so I'm sure that would be a whole nother perspective, of a civilization type game if it was Eastern European. So, and then, these games tend to do quite well in Europe, as I think one of the letters mentioned. There's a couple other companies that are pretty competitive in this space, which I haven't played. So I'm betting they have a different perspective on things just being built in Europe and in Eastern Europe. But
yeah, for sure. I mean, Paradox is
Paradox.
The canonical example there. Anyway, I have one last email which refers to my Twitch stream. So Persona 5 is the subject. It's from Ben from Iowa. Hope you're voting or caucusing today, Ben. This was recorded on Monday. So I'm listening to some old episodes. Back in 2016, during Day of the Tentacle, Brett said he thought he would get to Persona 5 next summer, in quotes. Took a little longer than expected. Just thought that was quite a gem of a quote. Thanks, Ben from Iowa. So yes, that refers to my, I've been playing that on my Twitch stream at twitch.tv/Brett Douville. It's been fun. I'm like 45 hours into that game, nowhere near the end. But yeah, 2017, I was shipping Tacoma. Towards the end of that year, I got carpal tunnel so bad that I spent all of 2018 only working. And then by the time 2019 came around, I was sort of slowly making my way back into games. And I guess I might have gotten to it, by summer of 2017, if not for that. But life intervened. So glad to be finally getting to it. It's a great game. It's a lot of fun. But with that, we shall move on. Thanks for the emails to devgameclub@gmail.com. You can also find the podcast. I guess we should, before we move to that, we're going to finish a game of this time, right? Win, lose, or draw. That's what we'll aim for next week.
Makes the most sense, yeah. And then we talked about maybe doing some other things after, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll talk about those off mic about the future after that. But at the very least, we're going to try to get through one full sim game of Civ for the end of next episode, or for next episode to discuss and talk about our victory or defeat. I might try to fit in a few more games just to kind of get my head around the thing a little bit more, and maybe to have a more traditional style of game, since I'm currently commanding a whole continent's resources in my sort of game that I've gotten the furthest along. You can find the podcast on the web at devgameclub.com or on Twitter at devgameclub, where you can also find my co-host at
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end.
I am drifting away again, but I suppose you could find me at Brett_Duville, or as I mentioned, at twitch.tv/Brett Duville, where I have been streaming Persona 5, and we'll probably do some Civ over next weekend. Thanks so much for joining us, and good night.
Good night.